Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. I want you to start off today by just, imagining something for me. Imagine walking away from your entire career, your home, your steady income, your livelihood.
Right, everything you've spent decades building.
Exactly. Your social standing, your community, just gone in an afternoon.
Yep.
And not because you were fired or anything.
Not because of a scandal or a mistake.
Right, simply over a matter of principle, a firm line in the sand regarding your conscience. It sounds, almost unthinkable today, doesn't it? When was the last time you saw a massive group of professionals voluntarily step into poverty because of a deeply held belief?
You really just don't see it happen.
You don't. But in 1843, over 400 ministers in Scotland did exactly that.
Wow.
Yeah, they walked out of the national church, they handed back the keys to their comfortable homes, they gave up those guaranteed state salaries, and they caused what can really only be described as a massive cultural and economic earthquake across the entire nation.
It truly was an act of, staggering moral courage. And the ripple effects of that single day fundamentally reshaped the social, the political, and the religious landscape of an entire nation. But to really understand the magnitude of this event, you have to understand that this wasn't just some spontaneous, hot-headed protest. It wasn't a sudden riot.
Like a spur-of-the-moment thing.
Right. It was the culmination of a decade-long, grueling struggle orchestrated by a man who arguably had the absolute most to lose out of anyone in the country.
And that is exactly what we are going to explore today in this deep dive. We are taking a comprehensive, magnifying glass look into the extraordinary life of the Reverend Dr. Thomas Chalmers.
Specifically focusing on his later years.
Yeah, as detailed in Volume 4 of his incredibly dense memoirs, written by his son-in-law, the Reverend William Hanna. Our mission today is to figure out how a man who was celebrated by the absolute highest echelons of British society, a man who loved ancient institutions and establishment power, somehow became the rebel architect of a massive grassroots uprising.
It's quite a pivot.
It really is. We're going to examine the mechanics of how he built a parallel national institution completely from scratch, and how he practically invented the concept of the modern urban city mission.
And we should probably set the stage for you regarding the material we are pulling from today. Reverend William Hanna's memoir is, it's a formidable 19th century text.
Formidable is a polite word for it. It's massive.
Yeah, it's a massive treasure trove of primary documents, personal journals, private letters, and legislative records. Now, on the surface, unpacking 19th century Scottish ecclesiastical politics can seem like a totally daunting challenge.
Very daunting.
You are dealing with a world of complex legal battles, obscure theological nuances, and archaic government structures. But underneath all of that historical dust lies a deeply human, incredibly inspiring, and highly relevant story for us today. It is essentially a masterclass in leadership, the psychology of social reform, and, the mechanics of standing firm in your convictions when the entire weight of the government is pressing down on you.
So to really appreciate the fall, or rather the intentional leap that Chalmers takes, we have to start by looking at exactly where he was standing in the mid-1830s. If you were graphing his career trajectory, this era represents the absolute summit.
The very peak.
He is not just a well-known local pastor. He's a global intellectual superstar. He gets elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, which places him among the top scientific and philosophical minds of his generation. And even more impressively, he is chosen as a corresponding member of the Royal Institute of France.
Specifically in the Academy of the Moral and Political Sciences, which is an exceptionally rare honor.
Very rare.
The French Academy was arguably the most elite intellectual institution in the world at that time. For a Scottish clergyman to be recognized by them was practically unheard of. The memoir actually notes that Chalmers was the first Scottish clergyman to ever receive that specific combination of elite, literary, and scientific distinctions.
Wait, why did the French care about a Scottish pastor? What exactly was moral philosophy in this context that made him so famous over there?
That is a crucial question, actually, because it reframes how we view him. In the 19th century, theology, philosophy, economics, and sociology weren't entirely separate university departments like they are today.
No, they were all kind of blended together.
Exactly. They were deeply intertwined. Chalmers wasn't just writing sermons about getting to heaven. He was writing massive treatises on political economy. He was analyzing how wealth moves through a society, how poverty is created, and how human communities either thrive or collapse.
Wow.
So the French Academy recognized him not necessarily for his Calvinist theology, but for his groundbreaking theories on social organization and poverty relief. He was seen as a heavyweight thinker who could bridge the gap between the spiritual condition of mankind and the hard mathematical realities of economics.
And his celebrity status isn't just on the continent. In 1835, he receives an honorary Doctor of Laws, an Ll.D., from the University of Oxford.
A massive honor for him.
All right, now picture this. You have a serious 55-year-old Scottish Presbyterian minister. You might expect him to accept an award from an ancient high church English university with a sort of stoic, detached, very serious dignity.
A very stiff upper lip.
Exactly. But the source material gives us this incredibly charming, unguarded glimpse into his actual personality. He didn't play it cool at all. He had this boyish, almost giddy delight in the whole experience.
I love this part of the memoir.
It's so good.
Yeah.
The Earl of Elgin, who accompanied him, wrote letters describing how Chalmers completely surrendered to the academic grandeur of Oxford. During the ceremony, they invested him with a scarlet silk gown and a black velvet cap. And he loved this academic costume so much that he didn't just wear it for the ceremony. He actually bought the robes to take home with him to Scotland.
It's just a wonderful visual, isn't it?
It really is. The Earl of Elgin describes Chalmers getting up before 8 o'clock in the morning, putting on his black doctor's gown, and just wandering around the ancient quads of Oxford by himself.
Just exploring.
Yeah, looking for hidden courtyards, admiring the architecture, completely enchanted by the history of the place.
And you know, this delight in Oxford actually reveals a profound central paradox in Chalmers' character that we have to understand if we're going to make sense of what he does later.
What do you mean?
Well, here is a man who is deeply evangelical. His heart, his life's work, is focused on the poorest, most destitute people in the slums of Glasgow and Edinburgh. Yet simultaneously, he unapologetically loves the immense grandeur, the ancient history, and the overwhelming intellectual weight of elite institutions like Oxford.
So he doesn't see those two things as contradictory at all. Loving the slums and loving the elite academy.
Not at all. In his mind, they were perfectly complementary. He believed deeply in the concept of the establishment. He believed that venerable state-supported institutions, whether that was a national church or an ancient university, were absolutely essential for human flourishing.
Like anchors for society.
Precisely. He saw these institutions as the ultimate guardians of social order, of rational liberty, and of advanced learning. You have to remember the context of the 1830s. Europe had spent the last few decades dealing with the fallout of the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and massive, violent social upheavals.
A lot of chaos.
Exactly. Chalmers looked at a world that felt increasingly chaotic, agitated, and radicalized. And he believed that deeply rooted institutions were the necessary anchors to keep society from tearing itself apart.
He believed the state and the church should essentially be married, right? They should work hand in hand to elevate the morality and the living conditions of the everyday citizen. And that core belief is what drives him to launch his grand vision, which he called the Church Extension Scheme.
Correct. The Church Extension Scheme was his absolute obsession during this period. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Hundreds of thousands of people were migrating from rural agricultural areas into the rapidly expanding cities to work in the factories.
We're talking explosive, completely unregulated urban growth.
Yes. So you have massive working-class populations crammed into hastily built, unsanitary tenements. And from Chalmers' perspective, the greatest tragedy was that the national church had not expanded to meet them.
So there were just massive areas with no resources at all.
Right. Entire sprawling districts in Edinburgh and Glasgow where there was no church, no school, no pastoral care, no social safety net of any kind. He called these areas desolate and unclaimed wastes. He desperately wanted to build more churches in these exact locations. But it wasn't just about constructing a building with a steeple. He wanted to execute a massive expansion of the parochial system.
Let's define that for the listener really quick. What exactly does he mean by the parochial system?
The parochial system, or the parish system, meant dividing a city into small, manageable geographical territories. Instead of having a massive megachurch where thousands of anonymous people show up on Sunday, Chalmers wanted a small church embedded in a specific neighborhood.
Okay, so hyper-local.
Exactly. The minister and his team of elders and deacons would be responsible only for the people living within those few city blocks. They would visit every single home, rich or poor, churchgoer or not. They would establish a local school for the children of that specific parish.
It's basically hyper-local community organizing.
Precisely. They would know everyone by name, understand their economic struggles, and provide both religious instruction and localized social care. But to build hundreds of these new local parish churches and to guarantee a salary for the ministers and teachers so they wouldn't have to rely on the impoverished locals for survival, he needed massive funding. He needed a government endowment.
And this is where Chalmers, the brilliant idealistic philosopher who wants to save the soul of the cities, runs headfirst into a brick wall. The reality of 19th century partisan politics.
Oh, yep.
He takes this grand church extension scheme, packs his bags, goes down to London, and starts pitching it to the government. At this time, political power in Britain was oscillating constantly between the Conservative Party, known as the Tories, and the Liberal Party, known as the Whigs. And we really need to explicitly state to the listener right now, we are taking absolutely no political sides here.
Right. We are simply reporting the historical reality of how 19th century politicians treated religious institutions as political pawns.
Exactly. Both sides essentially viewed his grand moral vision through the lens of their own political survival.
If we look at the conservative side, you had Sir Robert Peel. At one point, the Conservatives throw a massive banquet in Glasgow to honor Peel. And when I say massive, the sources note there were over 3,400 people in attendance.
Think about the logistics of feeding 3,400 people in a single hall in 1835. That alone shows the scale of the political machinery at work here.
It was a monumental event. And at this banquet, Sir Robert Peel stands up and speaks glowingly of Chalmers' scheme. He publicly pledges his hearty, cordial support for extending the national church into the industrial cities.
So they were fully on board.
Outwardly, very friendly. The Conservatives generally viewed the established church as a vital, stabilizing force. They liked social order, and they saw Chalmers' plan as a way to maintain order among the working classes.
So Chalmers thinks he has a win. But then governments change. Soon, the Whig government, led by Lord Melbourne, is in power. Now, initially, Melbourne seems open to the idea of the church extension. But the Whigs had a very different political coalition. They relied heavily on the political support of the dissenters.
We should clarify who the dissenters were. These were Protestants who, for various historical and theological reasons, had separated from the official state-sponsored Church of Scotland. They had formed their own independent congregations, they built their own buildings and paid their own ministers out of their own pockets, entirely without state help.
Right. So you can imagine their reaction when they hear that Thomas Chalmers is asking the government to take taxpayer money and give it exclusively to the established church to build hundreds of new buildings.
They were outraged.
Completely. They strongly opposed giving state money to an establishment they fundamentally disagreed with. So they started applying massive political pressure on Lord Melbourne's government.
And feeling that heat from his political base, Melbourne gets cold feet. He does what politicians have done for centuries when faced with a controversial issue they don't want to deal with. He appoints a royal commission to investigate the matter.
The classic delay tactic. We're forming a committee to study the problem.
Exactly. And delay they did. Years pass. The commission conducts its massive surveys. And eventually, they file reports that actually validate everything Chalmers was saying. The data showed massive religious and social destitution. In Edinburgh alone, the commission found that nearly a third of the entire population wasn't attending any church or receiving any localized social care.
The problem is undeniable. The data proves it.
Yes, but the politics hadn't changed. Finally, after all this delay, the Whig government proposes a heavily watered-down bill. And the bill explicitly states that while they might provide some minor endowments for rural country parishes, they will do absolutely nothing for the large towns. No government grant would be made for the great cities.
Which completely defeats the entire purpose of Chalmers' plan. The crisis was in the cities.
It completely gutted it. So a deputation of church leaders, deeply frustrated, travels to meet with Lord Melbourne in person to protest this. They point out that abandoning the cities was abandoning the core of their mission, leaving the most vulnerable populations to rot.
And Lord Melbourne's response, which is recorded in the Memoirs, is incredibly revealing.
In a tone of good-natured, almost aristocratic nonchalance, he listens to their passionate pleas, shrugs, and replies, "You may not be the better for our plan, but hang it, you cannot surely be worse."
Hang it, you cannot surely be worse. It's just staggering. I mean, think about the sheer dismissiveness of that statement. You have these men pouring their lives into trying to save the destitute, and the prime minister basically says, well, my plan won't help you, but hey, it won't kill you either.
Right.
Okay, let's unpack this. He's basically lobbying the government for a massive social infrastructure bill, but getting the classic political runaround. It's like a modern tech founder trying to get federal funding for public Wi-Fi. Everyone says they love the idea, but no one wants to foot the bill or anger their base. So they pass a bill that gives Wi-Fi to a few rural farms and completely ignores the urban centers. And then they expect you to thank them for it.
That analogy captures the frustration perfectly. Chalmers is navigating a landscape where his profound, burning moral urgency is constantly met with cold political calculus. He begins writing private letters to his friends during this time, and the tone shifts dramatically. He writes about how jaded, exhausted, and overborne he is by the endless, fruitless negotiations in London.
He realizes the state doesn't view the church as a spiritual partner at all.
Exactly. The state views the church merely as one of many competing political special interest groups to be managed.
Which brings us to the great turning point. Because we have to ask ourselves, how does a man who fundamentally loves the establishment, a man who proudly wears his Oxford robes and spent years passionately lobbying to work with the government, how does he end up leading a massive, unprecedented exodus against that very same government?
To understand that pivot, we have to look at the massive collision that occurs between church and state. Interestingly, the spark that ignited this massive explosion wasn't actually the funding issue for the new churches. It was something much deeper, a conflict known as the Non-Intrusion controversy. And at the very center of this controversy was an archaic legal concept known as patronage.
Let's break down patronage, because it is so foreign to how we think about organizations today. In the 19th century Church of Scotland, who actually had the power to choose the minister for a local church.
It wasn't the congregation. It was the wealthy landowners, the aristocratic lords, known as the patrons. Because these wealthy families had historically endowed the church land or built the buildings centuries earlier, the civil law granted them the perpetual legal right to appoint the ministers to those local churches.
Wait, so it didn't matter at all what the local congregation wanted. If I'm a working class guy sitting in a pew in a rural Scottish village, a wealthy lord who might live 300 miles away in London and never even visit my church could just point to a man and say, he is your new pastor, even if the entire parish opposed him.
Yes.
Even if he was a terrible speaker or held completely different theological views.
Exactly. The patron held the legal property right to the presentation of the minister. The spiritual needs or desires of the local people were legally irrelevant. Now, as the evangelical movement within the Church of Scotland began to grow in the 1830s, led heavily by Chalmers, they found this system deeply offensive to human dignity and to spiritual health. They argued that forcing a pastor onto an unwilling congregation destroyed the pastoral bond.
So what did the church do about it?
They tried to fix it internally. In 1834, the General Assembly, which is the highest governing body of the Church of Scotland, passed what was called the veto law. This was an internal church regulation. It didn't try to strip the patrons of their property rights to nominate a man.
Okay.
It simply stated that once the patron nominated a minister, the local congregation had the right to reject him. If the majority of the male heads of families in the parish formally objected to the nominee, the church presbytery would veto the appointment, and the patron would have to pick someone else.
That seems like a very reasonable compromise. You keep your historic right to nominate, but the people get a veto if the guy is terrible.
They called the principle non-intrusion, the basic idea that a pastor should not be intruded upon an unwilling flock. But the wealthy patrons did not see this as a reasonable compromise. They saw it as an illegal infringement on their absolute property rights. And they didn't take this lying down. They bypassed the church courts entirely and took the matter straight to the secular civil courts.
And this is where the constitutional crisis begins. The civil courts, all the way up through the Scottish Court of Session and eventually to the House of Lords in London, look at the veto law. And they rule that the Church of Scotland acted illegally. They decree that the veto law is null and void and that civil property rights trump church regulations.
But the secular courts didn't just strike down the veto law. This is where the situation escalates from a legal disagreement into a full-blown spiritual crisis. The civil courts dictated that the church must proceed to ordain these unwanted men.
Forced ordination.
Yes. The historical records are filled with these highly publicized traumatic cases. We see this in the famous cases of Auchterarder, Ll.D, and Marnock. In these parishes, the patrons nominated men that the congregations near unanimously rejected. The church, following its veto law, refused to ordain them. The rejected nominees and their patrons went to the civil courts. And the civil judges ordered the church presbyteries to physically lay hands on these men, ordain them, and make them ministers.
Under threat of severe civil penalties.
Yes, massive fines, and even imprisonment for the church officials who refused.
Okay, wait a minute. Let's pause and really look at the mechanics of this, because I want to make sure I'm getting this right. A secular judge, sitting in a courtroom, is issuing a legal mandate forcing a group of pastors to perform a spiritual ordination ceremony against their will.
Yes, they absolutely did.
And it gets even crazier than that. The memoirs detail what happened in a district called Strathbogie. In that region, the local presbytery, a group of local ministers, decided they were more afraid of the civil judges than they were of the church leaders. So they agreed to obey the civil courts and ordain an unwanted man.
Yes, the infamous Strathbogie case. Because this local presbytery openly rebelled against the laws of the church, the General Assembly of the church suspended those ministers. The church sent other loyal ministers into the Strathbogie district to preach the gospel and serve the congregations, while the rebellious ministers were suspended.
But the suspended ministers run to the civil courts for protection.
Exactly. And the secular civil courts issued interdicts, which are severe legal injunctions, forbidding the replacement ministers appointed by the church from preaching the gospel or administering sacraments anywhere in that entire district.
Wow.
Think about the sheer magnitude of that overreach. A secular government judge is issuing a legal order banning duly appointed Christian ministers from preaching a sermon in a specific geographical area under threat of jail time.
Okay, I have to jump in here. Because as a modern person looking back at this, my initial reaction is, well, isn't this just a massive turf war over money and power? Let's look at the reality. The Church of Scotland is the established church. They are receiving massive amounts of state funds. They get their buildings, their land, and their guaranteed salaries from the government.
True.
So if the state is paying the bills, shouldn't they get a say in who gets hired? If I take a job at a corporation and take their salary, I don't get to tell the CEO that I'm immune to their HR policies. If you take the government's money, don't you have to follow the government's rules? Isn't the government just enforcing standard employment law here?
It is a totally valid question, and it is exactly the argument that the civil judges and the politicians were making at the time. To understand why Chalmers absolutely rejected that logic, we have to dig deep into the historical constitutional theory of Scotland, which requires some careful critical thinking.
Okay.
To Chalmers and the Evangelical Party, the distinction between civil authority and spiritual authority was an absolute hard line given by God. They believed that while the state rightfully controlled the buildings and the salaries, what they called the temporalities, the state had zero jurisdiction over the soul of the church. The church, and the church alone, derived its authority directly from God to govern spiritual matters.
So you're saying they saw ordination, the act of making someone a minister, not as a hiring process, but as a purely spiritual act.
Precisely. Ordaining a minister, preaching the gospel, administering communion, these are not administrative tasks. They are sacred spiritual functions.
So to them, the state writing a paycheck buys you the building, but it doesn't buy you the right to dictate theology or force a congregation to accept a spiritual leader they believe is unfit.
Exactly. Chalmers summarized this constitutional boundary brilliantly. When faced with the civil courts demanding spiritual obedience, he declared, quoting the Apostle Paul, "To whom we give place by subjection, no, not for an hour." He clarified the historical bargain that had been struck centuries ago between the established church and the Scottish government. He said that when the church joined with the state, we gave them our services, but not our liberties.
We gave them our services, but not our liberties. That is a powerful distinction.
It was the bedrock of their argument. Chalmers argued that if a civil judge can use the threat of prison to force a congregation to accept a minister they despise, or if a secular court can legally ban a minister from preaching the gospel in a Scottish town, then the church fundamentally ceases to be a spiritual body.
It's completely hollowed out.
Exactly. It just becomes a puppet of the state, a mere department of civil administration, like the post office or the tax board. To Chalmers, submitting to this civil overreach would be a catastrophic violation of conscience and a total betrayal of the church's spiritual independence.
And as we're reading through the memoirs, it becomes painfully clear that this wasn't just a high-minded theoretical legal debate happening in the abstract halls of academia. Real men with real families were facing real devastating consequences.
They really were.
The civil courts were escalating the conflict, threatening massive fines and imprisonment for ministers who disobeyed them to follow the church's spiritual laws. The government in London absolutely refused to budge or pass any legislation to protect the church, treating it simply as a matter of a rebellious corporation disobeying the law of the land. Chalmers realized that writing brilliant pamphlets, publishing articles, and negotiating in London wasn't going to fix this.
The state was never going to concede.
They had reached a breaking point where they had to put their money, their homes, and their entire livelihoods where their mouths were.
Which leads us directly to the most dramatic event in 19th century Scottish history, the disruption of 1843. But the groundwork for that massive explosion was laid a year earlier, in November 1842, at a secretive, highly charged gathering known as the Convocation. As the crisis deepened, over 400 evangelical ministers traveled from all across Scotland, leaving their parishes to meet in a small, relatively obscure chapel in Edinburgh.
I can only imagine the atmosphere in that room. You have 400 men fully aware that the government is closing in on them, trying to figure out if they actually have the nerve to follow through on their principles.
The tension was palpable. For days, they debated, prayed, and agonized over the legal and moral implications. And finally, in that crowded room, they made a solemn, terrifying pledge. They drafted and signed a memorial stating clearly to the government that if the state did not back down, if the legislature did not pass a law granting them true spiritual independence, they would voluntarily relinquish their temporalities.
They put it in writing.
They did. They stated they would give up their state-funded churches, their manses, which were their homes, and their guaranteed incomes.
It's basically a massive game of constitutional chicken. They are betting that the government won't actually let the national church tear itself in half. They're saying, give us our freedom or we walk. And the government calls their bluff. The government does nothing.
And that brings us to the fateful day, May 18th, 1843, the day the General Assembly is scheduled to meet in Edinburgh. The entire nation is watching. The streets are packed with thousands of spectators.
Everyone is waiting to see what happens.
The central question on everyone's mind was, will they actually do it? Will hundreds of educated middle-class men voluntarily walk into total poverty?
Oh, yeah.
Will they actually give up their homes and their security for an abstract theological principle?
The scene described in the memoirs is so cinematic. The assembly meets in St. Andrew's Church. It is packed to the rafters. Dr. Welsh, who was the moderator of the assembly that year, takes the chair. Instead of proceeding with the normal business, he stands up, pulls out a piece of paper, and reads a formal, blistering protest against the civil courts and the government. He finishes reading, lays the document on the table, turns, and walks out the door.
And immediately, Dr. Thomas Chalmers stands up and follows him.
And then, pew by pew, bench by bench, hundreds of ministers and church elders stand up in complete silence and physically walk out of the building.
The impact of that moment cannot be overstated. As they exited the church, the massive crowd outside parted for them. These hundreds of ministers formed a massive procession and marched, three abreast, through the crowded, emotional streets of Edinburgh, winding their way down to a large rented hall at Cannon Mills. And there, in that hall, they officially constituted themselves as the Free Church of Scotland, completely severed from the state.
It is an incredibly dramatic moment.
It was unprecedented. There is a famous anecdote in the memoirs about Lord Geoffrey, a very prominent, skeptical Scottish civil judge. He was sitting quietly in his room reading a book when someone rushed in, practically out of breath, to tell him that over 400 ministers had actually walked out and given up everything.
What did he do?
Lord Geoffrey is reported to have thrown his book aside, sprung to his feet, and cried out, "I am proud of my country. There is not another country upon earth where such a deed could have been done." Even the secular judges who opposed them were staggered by the sheer moral conviction it took to execute that walkout.
But as we dive deeper into the sources, we discover something that really changes how you view this event. While the walkout looks like a sudden, dramatic, spontaneous explosion of conscience, it was actually a meticulously planned, highly organized operation. And this is where the sheer genius of Thomas Chalmers truly shines. Because while everyone else was agonizing over the theological debates and the courtroom drama over the last year, Chalmers was quietly sitting in his office, looking at the spreadsheet, planning for the aftermath.
Exactly. Chalmers was a visionary, but he was also a ruthless pragmatist. He foresaw the break long before it happened. He knew that if 400 ministers walked out, they would immediately have no income and no buildings. They would starve, and the movement would collapse within months.
So he started building the parachute before they ever jumped out of the plane.
He envisioned and designed an entirely new economic system to support a nationwide church without a single penny of state funding. He called it the Sustentation Fund.
The Sustentation Fund.
Wow.
And his mantra, his absolute catchphrase during this terrifying transitional period was brilliant. He just kept repeating, organize, organize, organize.
He realized a profound mathematical truth about crowds. He calculated that they didn't need the massive, wealthy endowment of the state if they could just mobilize the sheer volume of the ordinary working people. He realized that if they collected a tiny, almost unnoticeable amount, just a penny a week, from every single adult member of the church, the aggregate sum would be enough to fund a nationwide network of ministers, build new churches, and establish a parallel institution completely independent of the state.
Okay, we have to stop and appreciate the mechanics of this. It is literal 19th century crowdfunding. Think about this. He is building a recurring revenue subscription model for a massive national institution. It's like he invented Patreon in 1843.
That is an incredibly accurate way to look at it. He decentralized the funding model.
But how did he actually execute it? It's one thing to say, everyone give a penny. It's another thing to actually collect millions of pennies across a rugged country like Scotland without digital banking, without automated credit card charges, without the internet. How do you operationalize that?
Through an absolute masterpiece of administrative engineering and localized social organization. He didn't just ask for donations, he built a machine. Months before the disruption, he divided the entire map of Scotland into districts. Within every district, he set up local associations. He appointed specific individuals as collectors.
Right.
A collector was assigned a specific street or a specific block of cottages. Their job was to physically walk to those doors every single week and collect that one penny. He created a massive, incredibly disciplined hierarchy of regular, small, physical contributions that funneled up from the poorest crofter in the Highlands all the way to the central treasury in Edinburgh. He fundamentally proved that every day working-class people could financially sustain a massive, highly educated institution if they were properly organized and if they believed in the mission. He shifted the power base of the church from the wealthy aristocratic landowners down to the common people. He did it, and it was wildly successful. Within a few years, they had built hundreds of new churches, manses, and schools, entirely funded by the voluntary contributions of the people. But amidst all this talk of administrative genius and financial models, we must not lose sight of the profound human cost of this transition. It is very easy to look at the spreadsheets and the grand speeches, but the reality on the ground, especially in the first few winters, was often brutal and heartbreaking.
Right, because the wealthy landlords, the patrons who just lost all their power, were furious. And in many rural areas, these landlords owned all the land for miles around. So they didn't just refuse to help, they actively tried to crush the new free church. They refused to sell them any land to build new churches.
They did. In many parishes, the congregations had to worship outdoors, in the snow and the rain, because the local lord wouldn't let them pitch a tent on his property. And the ministers bore the brunt of this. Many of these men, who were highly educated scholars, left very comfortable, solid stone manses to live in deep poverty, often finding shelter in whatever dilapidated shack they could rent. The memoirs share a visceral, utterly tragic story told by Dr. Thomas Guthrie, another prominent Free Church leader, about a visit he made to a remote, rugged parish called Tongue in the far north of Scotland.
This story hits so hard. Walk us through what Dr. Guthrie found when he got to Tongue.
Guthrie traveled up there in the dead of winter. The local minister was an old, venerable man who had served that parish for decades. When the disruption happened, he and his son, who was also a minister, gave up their beautiful, warm manse for their principals. The local landlord refused them any shelter. Guthrie found them both living in a freezing, mean, drafty little cottage that offered almost no protection from the harsh northern weather. And the tragic reality was that they were both dying. They had both contracted a severe fever due to the constant exposure and privation they had endured since leaving their home.
The imagery is just haunting. Guthrie describes walking into this freezing hovel. You have this old, exhausted father, his nature just completely spent, sleeping upright in a chair because he can't breathe lying down. And in the very next room, his son is lying in a bed, actively dying. And Guthrie goes in to speak to the son. And the dying son's last words to Dr. Guthrie are just unforgettable. He looks up and says, "Mr. Guthrie, this is hard enough, but I thank God I don't lie here a renegade. My father's conscience and mine are at peace."
I thank God I don't lie here a renegade. It is the ultimate testament to the depth of their conviction. They literally chose to die of exposure in a freezing cottage with a clear conscience rather than live in physical comfort, having compromised their spiritual beliefs. They understood that the integrity of the soul was worth more than the warmth of the hearth.
It really grounds the whole story. This wasn't just a political debate. It was a matter of life and death for these families. And Chalmers, feeling the weight of these sacrifices, works himself to the bone. He becomes the first moderator of the newly formed Free Church. He oversees the incredible, chaotic logistical challenge of sustaining these men, building the new structures, and keeping the whole movement from fracturing under the pressure. Now, you would logically think that after achieving this impossible feat, after successfully launching a national institution and securing its survival, Chalmers, who's now well into his mid-60s, would finally take a breath.
You'd think so.
He has won his place in history. He could just retire, sit in a comfortable armchair in Edinburgh, and enjoy his status as the heroic founding father of the Free Church.
But that completely misunderstands the nature of the man. The moment the Free Church is stabilized, his mind immediately snaps back to his oldest, deepest concern. He doesn't look up at the elite society that praises him. He looks down into the darkest, most impoverished, most neglected corners of the city. He realizes that while he has saved the church, the destitute masses in the slums are still exactly where they were forgotten. Which brings us to the next massive phase of his life, the West Port experiment, and how he basically pioneers the modern methodology of the urban city mission.
So to fully grasp what he does in the West Port, we have to unpack a major political shift that was happening in Scotland at the exact same time. The government was rolling out a new system of poor laws. During this era, the state was expanding a formalized, government-run welfare system. They were levying poor rates, basically a specific tax on the middle and upper classes, and using that money to provide standardized, state-mandated financial relief to the destitute. It sounds, to modern ears, like a progressive, necessary step. But Chalmers was vehemently, passionately opposed to it. Why did a man who dedicated his life to the poor hate the idea of the government giving them money?
To understand his hatred of the poor laws, we have to look at the underlying mechanics of how that welfare was distributed and how it affected human psychology. Chalmers had studied poverty intensely during his earlier years in Glasgow. He believed that if you simply assess a tax, create a massive bureaucratic fund, and have a faceless government clerk hand out standard checks to anyone who qualifies, you fundamentally destroy the mechanics of human dignity and organic community.
How so? If someone is starving, doesn't that check feed them just as well as anything else?
It feeds the stomach, but Chalmers argued it starves the social fabric. In his view, state-mandated welfare severs the natural organic bonds of community support. In a healthy community, if a widow falls on hard times, her family steps up first. If the family can't, the neighbors step in. If the neighbors can't, the local church deacons, who know her personally, know her character, and know her specific needs, step in to help her through the crisis.
It's all built on actual relationships.
That transaction is built on relationship, compassion, and mutual responsibility. But when the state steps in with a universal poor rate, the psychology shifts entirely.
The wealthy feel they've paid their tax, so they don't need to care about their neighbors anymore.
Exactly. The wealthy wash their hands of personal charity. And on the other side, the recipient no longer views the help as a gift of compassion to be grateful for. They view it as a legal right to be demanded. Chalmers argued this replaced organic compassion with a cold, adversarial, bureaucratic system that ultimately trapped people in a cycle of dependency. He believed that if you just hand people money without addressing their character, their education, or their spiritual state, you are merely treating the symptom while totally ignoring the underlying disease.
So his argument is essentially, charity without relationship and without agency breeds resentment and dependence. He believed the only true cure for urban poverty was his parochial system: intense, hyper-local, community-based care, education, and spiritual instruction. He wanted to prove that a local church, deeply embedded in a slum, could solve poverty better than a massive state welfare apparatus.
And to prove his theory, he didn't pick an easy neighborhood. He intentionally targeted the absolute worst, most notorious district in Edinburgh, the West Port.
Set the scene for us. What was the West Port like in the 1840s?
The West Port was infamous across Scotland. It was a labyrinth of filthy, decaying tenements, narrow alleys, and absolute squalor. It was characterized by extreme generational poverty, rampant alcoholism, disease, and high crime rates. It was, in the minds of polite Edinburgh society, a completely irredeemable wasteland. People didn't go there unless they had to.
And Chalmers, at 65 years old, points at this slum and says, that's where we're going. He decides to build a city mission specifically for this hyper-local territory. He wants to plant a school and a church right in the middle of the filth, and he insists that it must operate exclusively for the people living within those specific boundary lines.
But the methodology he uses, the psychology behind his approach, is what makes the West Port experiment so groundbreaking and, frankly, so controversial even today. He didn't just walk into the West Port with a bag of money and start giving out free bread, free clothes, and free schooling.
Which is what you'd expect.
Right, but that would have directly contradicted his entire philosophy of human dignity. Instead, he did something that shocked many of the wealthy philanthropists in Edinburgh. First, he spent significant funds to hire an absolute top-tier, highly qualified educator, a Mr. Sinclair, to run the school. He didn't settle for a mediocre teacher for the slums. But then he mandated that the impoverished families of the West Port must be charged a fee of 2 pence a week to send their children to this school.
Okay, we have to pause here, because here is where the record scratches for a lot of people. I'm going to push back on this on behalf of anyone listening who works in modern social services. Why on earth would you charge destitute, starving people 2 pence a week? Isn't the whole point of a rescue mission to give things away freely to people who have absolutely nothing?
You know, it sounds harsh at first.
It feels like a barrier to entry. If they're living in abject poverty, forcing them to scrounge up coins to pay for schooling seems incredibly counterintuitive, maybe even cruel.
It absolutely feels like a barrier if you view the poor simply as passive victims who need to be rescued. But Chalmers understood the underlying mechanism of human dignity profoundly. He believed that the moment you make the education completely free, it becomes a handout, becomes a charity. And when you give someone a handout, you unconsciously place them in a subservient position. You pity them. But if you charge them a small, manageable fee, even just 2 pence, the entire psychological dynamic flips. They are no longer passive, dependent recipients of your pity. They are empowered patrons purchasing a service.
The psychology of agency versus pity.
Exactly. By paying that 2 pence, a father in the West Port, no matter how ragged his coat is, can walk into that school with his head held high, knowing he is financially supporting his child's education. He is buying a service, and therefore he has a right to demand quality from the teacher. It preserves his self-respect. It requires him to make a small, tangible sacrifice for his family's future, which builds moral character. Chalmers was incredibly fond of quoting the French diplomat Talleyrand, noting that there is nothing formidable in meeting with the very lowest of the people if you only treat them frankly.
Treat them frankly. Treat them as equals capable of responsibility. There's this incredible detail in the memoirs about the very first public meeting Chalmers held in the West Port to launch this mission. He didn't rent a fancy hall downtown and invite them. He went to them. The meeting took place in an old abandoned tan loft right in the middle of the slum.
A very humble setting.
Yeah, he gathered the genuine West Porters together in this smelly room. And he didn't patronize them. He didn't talk down to them or promise them free handouts. He stood up and told them exactly clearly what his group intended to do: build a top-tier school and church. But then he looked them in the eye and told them exactly what he expected them to do in return. He demanded their partnership. He expected them to pay the 2 pence, send their kids regularly, and uphold the moral standards of the community.
And the brilliance of his method is proven by the results. It worked phenomenally well. The people responded to being treated with dignity and high expectations. By the end of Chalmers' life, just a few years later, the West Port mission was absolutely thriving. The school was packed to capacity, the church was built and entirely filled with local residents, the crime rate had dropped visibly, and the entire social fabric of the neighborhood was being transformed.
That's amazing.
He empirically proved that his territorial city mission model worked. He proved that even the darkest slum could be revitalized, not through massive government handouts, but through hyper-local organization, top-tier resources, and the relentless promotion of personal agency. He essentially laid the blueprint for urban rescue missions for the next century.
It is a staggering administrative and physical achievement. But as we transition into the final chapters of his memoirs, we find a jarring contrast. Because while this incredible physical energy is being expended, building a national rebel church, micromanaging an urban mission in the slums, it is matched by a sudden, very surprising intellectual and spiritual pivot in his private life.
Yes, we enter what Chalmers referred to as his Sabbath decade. Chalmers had developed a deeply personal, almost poetic theory regarding the timeline of human life. He divided life into decades, and he viewed his 60s, his seventh decade, as the Sabbath afternoon of his earthly existence. He drew profound inspiration from observing his own mother's widowhood, which he spent in quiet, peaceful, spiritual preparation for death. He longed for this time to be a period of rest from the public battles. He wrote in his private journals that he wanted to spend this decade as if at the gate of heaven, detached from the controversies of the world.
He wants a quiet Sabbath afternoon. But the reality of his massive intellect is that he simply doesn't have an off switch. He is constitutionally incapable of just sitting in a rocking chair and meditating. So during this supposedly restful decade, what does he actually do? He begins writing his massive, definitive theological masterwork, The Institutes of Theology. He starts contributing incredibly heavy, complex intellectual articles to the newly founded North British Review. And perhaps most surprisingly of all, in his late 60s, he suddenly decides he needs to dive headfirst into heavy German philosophy.
Yes, he begins reading Immanuel Kant, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, and the other major figures of German idealism.
Why? I mean, he's a Scottish Calvinist minister who has just built a new church. Why on earth is he spending his supposed retirement agonizing over the incredibly dense, almost impenetrable metaphysical theories of Immanuel Kant?
Because he recognized the shifting tectonic plates of global intellectual thought. Chalmers was deeply rooted in the Scottish common sense school of philosophy, which believed that human beings could reliably understand reality and truth through observation and reason, supported by divine revelation. But Kant and the German idealists were fundamentally questioning the very nature of reality, the limits of human reason, and how we can even know what is true. They were decoupling morality from historical, biblical revelation and rooting it entirely in the human mind.
So Chalmers didn't just see this as an academic curiosity. He saw it as an existential threat.
Exactly. He saw a rising tide of intellectual skepticism and subjectivism coming from the continent. He believed that if these German philosophies took hold in the universities, it would eventually destroy the foundations of the Christian faith in Britain. He wasn't casually reading, he was conducting reconnaissance, he was trying to master the enemy's battle plans so he could equip the next generation of free church ministers to defend their faith in a rapidly changing intellectual landscape.
It is such a beautiful contradiction. You read his private journals, and he is constantly writing these soulful entries about wanting a quiet Sabbath decade, wanting to escape the noise and the friction of public life. But simultaneously, out in the real world, he is acting as the CEO of a rebel national church. He is personally organizing a city mission in the worst slums of Edinburgh. He is writing massive volumes of systematic theology, and he is trying to teach himself German metaphysics to combat the greatest philosophers of Europe. It's exhausting just to read about.
It speaks to a mind that finds its true, deepest rest not in idleness, but in the active, relentless engagement with truth. Yet what is so touching in the memoirs is that despite this intense, high-level intellectual combat, we see a profound, almost startling softening and tenderness in his personal life during this exact same period. There's a wonderful story about a visit he received from a prominent German theologian, Dr. Tholuck.
I love this story. Set the scene for us.
Chalmers was desperate to learn about the current theological and philosophical landscape in Germany firsthand. So when Dr. Tholuck visits, Chalmers doesn't act like the grand, imposing founder of the Free Church. He pulls a very low chair right up next to Tholuck. He sits there, looking up at him, listening with the utmost docility, like an eager schoolboy absorbing every word. And when the conversation ends and it is time for Tholuck to leave, the great, massive Scottish reformer is overcome with emotion. He spontaneously throws his arms around the German scholar, kisses him on the cheek, and mutters, with tears welling up in his eyes, "Even ein Kuss, even a kiss."
It shows such a deep, unguarded emotional capacity. He wasn't just a brain in a jar. And you see this exact same immense tenderness in his relationship with his family. The memoirs are filled with these charming, deeply affectionate monthly letters he wrote to his daughters and his grandchildren. He had this wonderful, playful nickname for his grandson, Tommy. When Tommy turned 9 years old, Chalmers started addressing his letters to "my dear 9 older." He wasn't a distant, austere historical monument. He was a deeply involved, affectionate grandfather who prayed fervently, by name, for his family's spiritual well-being every single day.
That emotional depth, that continuity of the heart is perhaps most poignantly illustrated by a trip he took in 1845. He travels back to visit his hometown, the small coastal village of Anstruther. At this point, he is 65 years old. He is a man of global renown. an Ll.D. of Oxford, the leader of a national movement. Yet his purpose for this trip is entirely sentimental. He wants to reconnect with the simplest, most visceral memories of his childhood. He walks the old, familiar path to his parish school. He enthusiastically points out to his companions Lizzie Gein's water bucket, remembering exactly where he and his friends used to stop and drink water after playing ball as little boys.
And the visit to the Barnesmuir estate. This might be my absolute favorite detail in the entire 900-page memoir. He visits Barnesmuir, which is the estate where his childhood crush lived when he was just a young boy. This woman had passed away many, many years before. Chalmers walks into the house, and he finds a small profile portrait of her hanging on the wall. He stands in front of this picture, and he just stares at it with intense, silent earnestness. And then he does something so surprisingly romantic and heartbreaking. He takes the picture down from the wall. He takes out his own personal calling card. He uses 2 small wafers to tape his calling card to the back of the portrait. He carefully hangs it back on the wall. And then, this giant of Scottish history just bursts into tears, muttering quietly to himself more than 40 years ago.
It is a breathtakingly human moment. We spend so much time studying his theology, his economic theories, and his political battles that we can forget the man himself. That single gesture reminds us that underneath the heavy academic robes, underneath the massive intellect that could debate prime ministers, was a heart that never really left his childhood village. The continuity of human emotion, the way love and memory endure across a lifetime of conflict and achievement, is perfectly captured in that one quiet moment in Barnesmuir.
He was a man who could command an audience of thousands, who could organize a nationwide financial rebellion, but who still wept over his first childhood crush and remembered his favorite water bucket. It proves that his massive, bruising public life didn't hollow out his private humanity. It's a beautiful thought.
Indeed. And this beautiful, highly reflective period, filled with these nostalgic visits, his intense theological writing, and the success of the West Port mission, was essentially the calm before the final curtain. Which brings us to the closing chapter of his memoirs and the end of his journey, the final rest.
In May 1847, Chalmers is called to travel to London one last time. He is summoned to testify before a special Sites Committee in Parliament. Remember how we discussed the wealthy landlords who were trying to crush the Free Church by refusing to sell them land to build on? The situation had gotten so bad that the government was finally forced to investigate. So Chalmers, tired and aging, travels south to spar with the politicians one last time.
He is brought in for examination by Sir James Graham, a very sharp political operator. And Chalmers handles the interrogation with his usual brilliant mixture of sharp intellect, deep historical knowledge, and unwavering principle. He spars politely, but he is completely immovable. He doesn't yield a single inch on the principles of spiritual independence that caused the disruption.
He wouldn't back down?
Not at all. Afterward, in a private letter to his family, he notes with a touch of his old wry humor that the government's examination eventually degenerated into what he called twaddle upon twaddle, but that he had held his ground perfectly. He had traveled to the seat of empire and delivered his final, definitive public defense of the church he had sacrificed everything to create.
His work was done. After the committee, he travels back home to Edinburgh. He arrives on a Friday. He spends a joyous, incredibly peaceful Sabbath day surrounded by his family. He attends church. He writes a warm, affectionate letter to his sister, expressing his deep peace. He goes to sleep that Sunday night, and he is found the next morning having passed away peacefully in his sleep. The sources describe his physical appearance the next morning. They say his face was in majestic repose, without the slightest sign of a struggle or pain. It was as if he had just slipped quietly from his peaceful Sabbath evening on earth directly into his eternal Sabbath rest.
It was a death that perfectly, almost poetically, mirrored his deepest, most fervent desires for his final years. He didn't die on a battlefield. He didn't die in a heated debate. He died in quiet rest. And if we look at the immediate aftermath, at what his death meant to the nation of Scotland, we see the true measure of the life he lived. His funeral was an absolutely unprecedented event in Scottish history. It wasn't a state funeral characterized by extrinsic wealthy trappings or military parades.
It was driven by the people.
Yes, it was built entirely on the genuine, visceral grief of the common people. The records state that well over half the entire population of the metropolis of Edinburgh lined the streets for miles to watch the massive procession go by. It wasn't a crowd of curious onlookers, it was a nation mourning its spiritual father. He died exactly as he had lived, entirely at peace with his conscience, having spent every ounce of his massive energy in the service of others.
So as we pull back and look at the entirety of this incredible journey we've taken through Thomas Chalmers' memoirs today, We've watched a man go from being the absolute darling of the elite Oxford establishment, draped in silk academic honors, to voluntarily becoming the rebel architect of the Free Church. He led hundreds of men out of the comfort of the establishment for the sake of an abstract principle of spiritual liberty. And then, instead of resting, he transforms again into the deeply empathetic, highly practical pioneer of the urban city mission, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the poorest, most crime-ridden neighborhoods can be completely revitalized through the mechanism of human dignity and relentless local organization.
He was a rare historical figure who understood that true, lasting leadership requires a combination of two things that rarely exist in the same person: profound, uncompromising philosophical conviction and the relentless, pragmatic, administrative energy required to execute those convictions in the messy real world. He didn't just write academic papers about the poor, he went into the slums and built the West Port mission. He didn't just theorize endlessly about church independence in a classroom, he built the mathematical machinery of the Sustentation Fund to make it a reality. He married the highest ideals with the grittiest practicalities.
Exactly. And that synthesis of idealism and pragmatic action leaves us with a final thought to mull over as we close out today. Think back to where we started this conversation. Imagining walking away from everything you've built, risking total ruin to build something entirely new based on a matter of conscience. Chalmers built a massive nationwide parallel institution in 1843, but he didn't do it with the backing of the state. He didn't have government grants. He didn't do it with the massive endowments of billionaire philanthropists. He built it through the meticulous, unglamorous organization of everyday working people, giving a single penny a week because they believed in the dignity of their cause. We live in a modern era where we so often assume that fixing our massive systemic problems requires either massive centralized government intervention or the intervention of elite billionaire philanthropy. But looking at Chalmers, we have to ask ourselves, what impossible institutions, what world-changing movements could we build today if we simply stopped waiting for the establishment to save us and instead decided to organize?
It is a deeply provocative question, and I can think of no more fitting tribute to his enduring legacy.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.